Blood found Ambrose Kane before his eyes did, and the silence of Ott's trading post that cold morning was about to change his life. He had ridden in only to collect a rifle. Instead, behind a splintered storeroom door, he found a woman bound, branded, and left for dead, the reason a war was about to begin. He hadn't set out expecting any of it. The morning had started ordinary, the kind of ordinary that only a rich man's calendar could produce. Ambrose Kane owned Kestrel Flats, 34,000 acres of grass and water spread across 3 valleys, freight contracts that ran clear to the territorial capital, money sunk into railways and timber he'd never once needed to think about twice. At 41, he was a kind of wealthy that didn't have to announce itself. People simply knew, the way they knew which direction the wind came from in October. Money bought comfort, sometimes protection. It never once bought peace. He'd commissioned a custom rifle from Ott 3 months back, a Winchester with silver inlay and his own initials worked into the stock. The sort of extravagance a man bought when he had money to burn and precious little left to spend it on. Ott had promised it would be ready along with the ranch's winter supplies. Routine business, the kind of errand Ambrose could have handed to his foreman without a second thought. But he liked the ride out, liked the quiet of it, the frost still clinging to the sage even after the sun cleared the ridgeline. Kestrel Flats hadn't come easy, whatever people assumed looking at it now. Ambrose had built the first of it with borrowed money, and a partner who died of fever before the second winter had bought out failing neighbors when the drought years came, had learned freight and timber and railway stock the hard way, one costly mistake at a time, until the mistake stopped costing him and started paying him instead. By the time Iris came into his life, he already had more than most men dreamed of and less peace than most men managed, with nothing at all. She used to say that money without purpose was just a very heavy kind of loneliness. He hadn't understood what she meant until after she was gone. The outpost came into view gold and still. A squat log building, roof patched with tar paper, an empty corral out front. That last part snagged at him. Ott always had a fire going this time of year, rain or shine, customers or none. Ambrose tied his horse to the rail and stood a moment listening. Nothing moved, no sound but wind scraping across dry hills. The door was unlocked, and that was the first wrong thing, because Ott bolted that door every night without fail, ever since drifters had cleaned out half his shelves 2 winters back. Ambrose pushed it open, and the smell reached him before anything else did. Copper, and something worse underneath it, flour dust, drifting through the light like snow settling over a battlefield. His hand found his revolver before his mind caught up with what his eyes were seeing. The store had been torn apart, shelves overturned, sacks of grain split open, goods scattered across the floor. In the middle of the wreckage, face down in blood gone black, lay Ott. His throat had been opened, ear to ear, so deep it looked less like a wound and more like an attempt to finish the job twice over. His hands curled into claws, fingers broken. Whoever had done this had wanted him to suffer first, and had gotten exactly what they wanted. Ambrose crossed the room slowly, boots grinding over broken glass, and didn't bother checking for a pulse. You didn't survive long out here being squeamish, but his stomach turned all the same. Then came a sound from the back room, faint, almost lost under the wind, not a loose board, breathing, labored, wet, and alive. He stepped toward the storeroom door, the wood around its latch splintered, as though someone had forced it shut from the outside rather than broken in. Anyone in there? Silence answered him, and then, barely audible, a voice, a woman's thin as thread. "Stay away!" Ambrose holstered the revolver and drew his knife instead. 3 hard kicks and the hinges tore loose from wood, gone soft with age. The storeroom sat dark, a single high window letting in 1 blade of light, the air thick with blood and something worse, burned flesh. It took his eyes a long moment to adjust, and when they did, he almost wished they hadn't. She was slumped against the far wall, behind stacked crates of ammunition, young, maybe mid-20s, dressed in the ruined remains of a riding outfit. One eye had swollen shut, her lips were split, crusted, dark. But it was her shoulder that stopped the breath in his chest. Someone had branded her. The mark sat raw, blistered, still weeping, a circle slashed through with 2 crossed lines, a shape every soul in the territory. The Coldwater mark. Don't. She tried to push herself upright and failed. Don't. They'll come back. Ambrose knelt beside her slowly, close enough now to see the rest of it. Rope-burned wrists rubbed to raw meat, bruises wringing her throat, boot prints stamped across her ribs. This hadn't been quick. Someone had taken their time. His voice stayed low, steady. "They're gone. It's just me. My name's Ambrose Kane. I'm going to get you out of here." She fixed her one good eye on him, and for a heartbeat, he thought she might fight him. Then something in her face broke open, and she managed a single nod. Della, the name came out cracked. Della Vance. Getting her onto his horse was worse than it should have been. She was too thin, dangerously so, and every movement pulled a gasp out of her she couldn't quite swallow. Broken ribs, at a guess, maybe worse. He'd seen men trampled by horses who looked better off. He didn't take her toward Cutter's Ford. That town belonged to the Coldwater Ring, the way a hand belongs to an arm, its marshal on their payroll body and badge alike. Handing Della to a Cutter's Ford doctor would have been no different than handing her straight back to the men who'd branded her. So he rode north instead, toward Kestrel Flats, where a woman named Miss Pruitt kept the household running and had once nursed soldiers through a war that had taught her which questions were better left unasked. Della didn't speak, just clung to the saddle horn with white knuckles, jaw locked against the pain. Twice she slipped into unconsciousness, and both times Ambrose stopped only long enough to be certain she was still breathing at all. By the time the ranch spread out below them, the stone main house, the barns arranged in neat rows, more horses in the corrals than some towns had residents, the sun stood high and hot, and Ambrose barely noticed the view anymore. He rode straight for the house, shouting for Miss Pruitt before he'd even swung down from the saddle. She came at a run from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and went still at the sight of what he carried. Her face hardened before she'd finished the thought. "Coldwater," Ambrose confirmed, sliding down to catch Della as she began to slip. "Get the guest room ready. No one else hears about this. Not the hands, not the foreman." Miss Pruitt was somewhere past 50, gray-haired, steel-spined, and had witnessed enough ugliness in her life that little surprised her anymore, though her hands still trembled a fraction as she led the way inside. Della woke to clean sheets and the smell of carbolic soap, and for one merciful moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the pain arrived, sharp and total, and everything came rushing back with it. The outpost, Deke Yarrow's hands at her throat, the iron burning into her skin while Rune Marsh watched and smiled like a man enjoying his supper. She tried to sit up and regretted it instantly. Don't. Miss Pruitt sat in a chair beside the bed, a bowl of water and a cloth in her lap, eyes that had seen too much to be easily rattled. "You're safe. You're at Kestrel Flats, Mr. Dad. Kane brought you here 2 days ago. 2 days. Della's throat felt like sand. Where is he? Downstairs. He'll want to know you're awake. Miss Pruitt set the bowl aside and leaned in. First, I need to look at that brand. I've been cleaning it, but it needs watching. Close. Della looked down at her own shoulder, bandaged, neat and tight, the pain dulled behind a wall of laudanum. The man who brought me here, Ambrose Kane. A dry note crept into Miss Pruitt's voice. You don't know who that is. He's the richest man in 3 territories, owns more land than some states claim. A week ago, I'd have called anyone a liar who told me he'd risk his neck dragging a Coldwater victim out of a murder scene. She stood, smoothing her skirts. But here we are, I'll fetch him. Footsteps on the stairs. Then the door opened, and Ambrose Kane walked in, looking cleaner than she remembered. Someone had clearly made him scrub off a woman's blood before letting him near polite company. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that would have been handsome if it weren't held so carefully blank. His hands carried the particular scars of a man who'd built his fortune before he'd had money enough to pay others to build it for him. Miss Vance. His voice stayed low, unhurried. How are you feeling? Della almost laughed. It came out a cough instead, like I got dragged behind a horse for 10 miles. Alive, though, thank you. He pulled a chair closer and sat. You don't need to thank me. Any decent person would have done the same. Her tone left no room to argue. They wouldn't, not with Coldwater involved. Something flickered across his face, quiet and grim. He wanted the whole of it, whatever she could give him. So she gave it to him, not all of it yet, but enough. How she and her brother Peter had been riding for the mining camps where he'd heard there was steady work. How they'd stopped in Cutter's Ford for supplies and crossed paths with Tobias Marsh in a saloon. How Peter had stepped between Tobias and his wandering hands, and how Tobias had smiled and promised to remember it. 3 nights later, riders in black dusters had come for their camp in the dark, dragged Peter off his feet, beaten him until he couldn't stand, and taken him. Della had tried to follow, tried to fight, and woken in chains in a room that smelled of old blood. They kept me there 2 weeks. Her voice had gone flat, mechanical, a recitation more than a memory. Deke Yarrow, their enforcer. He wanted me broken, compliant. That's the word he liked. Her fingers found the bandage at her shoulder without her seeming to notice. This was meant to remind me who I belonged to. Ambrose's face had gone very still. Della closed her eyes. They killed him. Rune Marsh runs the whole operation. Tobias is his brother. Rune made me watch a lesson, he called it. The room held nothing but the ticking of a clock somewhere below. Why leave you alive at all? The question came out low, careful. I don't know. Maybe they got bored. Maybe they figured I'd run and they'd hunt me down for sport. Della opened her eyes. Or maybe they just wanted me to keep suffering. Ambrose rose and crossed to the window, standing a long while looking out over his land, his empire, all that money and power spread beneath an indifferent sky. The Coldwater Ring has worked this territory 8 years. His voice carried the weight of something rehearsed too many times alone. Started small, protection, claim jumping, the usual outlaw business. Started buying people, lawmen, judges, freight companies. Now they move women and children like cattle, run goods through legitimate channels, and no one can touch them because half this territory sits in their pocket. He turned to face her. I've spent 3 years trying to bring them down ever since they killed my wife. Della stared at him. Your wife, Iris? His voice didn't shake, but his hands closed into fists at his sides. She ran a charity, helped women who'd been trafficked get somewhere safe. She found a route the ring used to move people, hidden compartments in freight cars, disguised as livestock. She brought the evidence to Marshal Croft, believing he'd help her. His jaw tightened. He carried it straight to Ruin instead. They found her body 3 days later in a ravine, dressed up to look like a fall from her horse. And Della meant it fully. Ambrose shook his head. After she died, I tried everything. Investigators, private men, a letter to the territorial governor himself. Nothing moved. Their reach runs too deep. I can buy 100 men, Miss Vance, but I can't buy justice when the whole system's gone rotten from the inside. He came back and sat elbows on his knees, leaning toward her. I didn't bring you here only out of charity. You've seen the inside of their operation. You know their faces, their routines, where they keep people. That's worth more than every dollar I own. Della's heart pounded. What are you saying? That I can protect you? Give you a place to heal, resources, whatever you need. But in return, a pause, deliberate, I want to burn them to the ground, all of them. And I need what you know to do it. Della studied him a long moment, this man with his imported wallpaper and his empty bed where a good woman used to sleep offering her a bargain, dressed up as mutual benefit. Smart. The Coldwater Ring didn't forgive, and it didn't forget. Going after them meant everything or nothing. It meant blood. But her hands were already stained. I want Ruin Marsh dead. Tobias, and Yarrow too. I want them to suffer the way my brothers suffered, the way I did. Then we're agreed, not yet. She pushed herself upright, despite her ribs screaming at her. I need to know why you actually care. You could take your money, leave, go somewhere civilized. Why stay and fight a war you might not win? A long quiet stretched before he answered, and when he finally did, his voice had gone raw. Iris asked something of me the night before she died. If anything happens, don't let them win. Don't let them keep doing this. I promised her I wouldn't. He held Della's eyes. Never that one. Della nodded slowly, throat tight. All right, here's my terms then. You give me what I need, guns, supplies, a place to plan, and, when the time comes, I'm not a weapon you point at your problems, I'm a partner. Equal stakes. Ambrose stood and offered his hand for it. Equal stakes. Della took it. His grip was firm, despite the wealth calloused in the way of a man who'd worked before he could afford to pay others to work for him. One more thing. Her voice had gone hard as flint. I'm going to kill them. Not capture them, not hand them to some bot marshal for a show trial. Kill. Fine by me, he said simply, and just like that, the war began. If a story like this keeps you up past midnight, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name to help more of these stories reach the screen. Over the following 2 weeks, Della healed slowly and painfully. Miss Pruitt changed her bandages daily, cleaned the brand until the infection finally receded and scar tissue began to knit over the wound. The mark itself would never fade. Della already understood that much. She would carry Runemarsh's signature on her skin for the rest of her life. Let it be a reminder, then. Ambrose gave her the guest room and passed word to his hands that she was a distant cousin recovering from a fever. Nobody pressed further. Men who worked for Ambrose Kane learned early which questions were better left alone. In the evenings, once Miss Pruitt had gone home and the ranch settled into quiet, Ambrose and Della sat in his study and planned. It was a strange room, one wall of real leather-bound books, another lined with maps of freight routes and mining claims, and a third wall, bare but for a single photograph in a silver frame. A dark-haired woman with kind eyes in a dress that likely cost more than Della's family had earned in a year. Iris Kane. On the third night, whiskey poured and a notebook open, Ambrose wanted to know about the ranch, the hidden one where they'd taken her. Della closed her eyes, pulling the memory back into focus. North of Cutter's Ford, maybe 15 miles up where the pine gets thick. You'd never know it was there unless you were looking. Corals, bunkhouse, a big lodge, looks like any ranch. From the road, she opened her eyes. But underneath, there's a second floor, dug straight into the hillside. That's where they keep people. That's where they took Peter. Ambrose's pen scratched across the page. How many men? I counted maybe 17 when I was there, but they rotate. Some are just ranch hands who don't know what's underneath them. Others, she shuddered, others are Yarrow's crew. They enjoy the work. Guards at the entrance, 2 at the gate, 1 at the tunnel door. More on transport days. Transport days. Della gave a small nod. Every couple weeks, they move prisoners out, load them into wagons dressed up as supply runs, take them to the rail depot at Millrace Junction, from there, shipped east. I don't know where, Rune kept that part quiet, even from me. Ambrose's pen went still. Millrace Junction sits on my freight line. I know, I heard them talking. They use your wagons, your contracts. You're the cover, and you never even knew it. For a moment, Della thought he might hurl the glass in his hand across the room. Instead, he set it down with exaggerated care and stood. How long has this been happening? Before I got there, certainly. He walked to the window. Stars were coming up cold over the valley. I've been funding them this whole time, every wagon that rolls out with my name stamped on the side, and I've been helping them move people like freight. He turned. Did Iris know? I can't be sure. If she was already digging, she might have worked it out on her own. His hands were shaking. Della had never seen a man look so furious and so broken in the same breath. We end this. Whatever it costs, every contract, every dollar. We end this? Good, she returned, because I'm not stopping until every last one of them is dead. 3 days later, a man arrived at Kestrel Flats, Amos Webb, a scarred, one-eyed blacksmith who'd lost his daughter to the ring 2 years back. Ambrose had tracked him down through old contacts and offered him nothing but a shot at revenge. Amos took one look at the raised scar on Della's shoulder and wanted only to know when they'd begin. 2 days after him came a woman named Nell Sharp, lean, sharp-eyed, missing 2 fingers on her left hand, an explosives hand for the Union Army during the war before her husband got caught stealing Coldwater opium. She'd been running from them ever since, and word had reached her that someone was looking to blow something up. Several things, in fact. Her grin, when it came, wasn't a friendly one. She was in. A drifter named Wyatt Lowe, who'd watched the ring burn his family's farm for sitting on land they wanted, and who carried a Bible in one saddlebag and a sawed-off shotgun in the other, and never once explained how he squared the two with himself. A former hand named Beatrice Nash, sold to Rune Marsh at 15 and escaped at 19, carrying knife scars and a hatred that could melt iron, who took to Della almost instantly, the way survivors of the same fire sometimes recognize each other. A tracker who went only by Grey Hawk, who never once explained why he wanted the ring destroyed, but whose aim with a rifle carried its own quiet argument, and who could vanish into brush that shouldn't have hidden a rabbit. They weren't soldiers, they weren't heroes, they were survivors, the discarded, the forgotten, people chewed up by the Coldwater machine and spat out to die who had, against every likelihood, refused to. Some evenings the bunkhouse filled with something almost like laughter, Amos telling stories about the daughter he'd lost until the stories stopped being sad and started being simply hers again. Nell arguing with Wyatt about whose God, if either of theirs existed. Della watched it happen and understood slowly that Ambrose hadn't just assembled a raiding party. He'd built the beginnings of a family out of people the world had already thrown away twice over. It was the first thing in weeks that had made her chest feel less like a fist. Ambrose gave them what they needed, weapons from his own armory, horses, a bunkhouse far from the main ranch where they could plan unseen. Money, not much, but enough. Food, shelter, purpose. Miss Pruitt watched Amos and Wyatt drill with rifles in the south pasture one morning and called it plainly for what it was, the beginnings of an army. A reckoning, Ambrose corrected, and there wasn't much difference between the two words as far as she could tell. She handed him coffee, black and strong, and warned him plainly that this could ruin everything he'd built, that if folks learned he was harboring people, arming an attack on what most of the territory believed was a legitimate outfit, let them think what they like, he returned. I'm through playing by rules written by cowards and criminals. Something in her face eased, though she didn't quite smile. Iris would be proud of you. He didn't answer that one at all. He only watched his unlikely army train and thought about promises kept and blood owed. 6 weeks after Ambrose found her dying in a back room, Della stood before the mirror in the guest room and barely recognized herself. The swelling had gone. The bruises had faded from black to a sickly yellow-green. The brand had healed into a raised, permanent scar, and Miss Pruitt's promise that it would soften with time had proven only half true. Some marks simply didn't. But Della was stronger now, too. In the first week, she'd barely managed to walk unaided. By the 4th, she was riding again. By the 6th, she could outshoot half the men in Ambrose's makeshift company. Purpose, it turned out, made for excellent medicine. Some mornings, before the rest of the ranch stirred, Della walked the training paddock alone, working through the motions Beatrice and Amos had drilled into her. Draw, aim, reload, draw again, until her hands stopped shaking on their own and started shaking only when she let them. She thought more than once about the woman she'd been before Cutter's Ford, a woman who'd never fired a gun at another living soul and never imagined she'd need to. That woman was gone now, burned away, as surely as the brand had burned into her shoulder, and some nights Della mourned her almost as much as she mourned Peter. But mourning, she'd learned, it could be fuel too, same as the scar. A knock came at her door. Ambrose entered, carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. Thought you'd want this. He set it on the bed and unwrapped it. A gun belt and a revolver. Plain but well kept. A weapon a person could trust. Beneath it, a coat, brown leather worn soft at the elbows, bone buttons inside pockets. Della's breath caught. "Where did you find this?" "At the outpost, when I rode back to see Ott properly buried. It was in the storeroom with you. I'm guessing it belonged to your brother." Della lifted the coat with shaking hands. It still carried a faint trace of him, tobacco, wood smoke, the cheap soap he'd always used. She pressed it to her face, and for one unguarded moment she was back at their camp, watching Peter laugh at some foolish joke, hands waving as he described the life they were going to build. Her thanks came out in barely more than a breath. Ambrose only nodded. "We meet tonight. Final planning. If you're ready." "I'm ready." She put the coat on. It fit like armor. 3 days before the planned raid, Ambrose rode alone into Cutter's Ford. A calculated risk that nearly cost him a skillet to the skull once Miss Pruitt heard of it at breakfast. But Ambrose had legitimate business associates in town, men who owed him favors and had learned not to ask inconvenient questions. If prisoners were moving in a matter of days, there would be talk. Manifest to check, wagons being loaded. Someone would know something. Cutter's Ford sprawled along a muddy street, buildings propped up more by habit than sound framing, a town that had boomed on a silver strike 15 years back and settled slowly into decline once the ore played out. What remained was a population too stubborn or too broke to leave, and enough saloons to keep them from minding. The marshal's office squatted at the north end, brick-barred windows, a flagpole that hadn't flown a flag in years. Ambrose kept well clear of it. Marshal Croft belonged to Coldwater, the way a shadow belongs to the thing that casts it, and walking through that door would have been the same as announcing his intentions with a brass band. Instead, he found the land office, a narrow room squeezed between a barber shop and a boarding house, where a clerk, named Emmett Doyle, sat behind a desk stacked high with ledgers. Emmett was 60 nearsighted, and owed Ambrose money on a bad timber contract Ambrose had graciously forgiven. He went pale with nerves the instant he recognized his visitor. "Mr. Kane, I wasn't expecting—" "Relax, Emmett. I'm not here to collect." Ambrose closed the door behind him. "I need freight manifests. Anything moving through Millrace Junction this next week. Who's shipping, what, and where it's headed." Whatever color remained in Emmett's face drained away. "Those records are meant to stay confidential." Ambrose's tone never rose, but something in it made the old man flinch. "I'm asking about shipping through a junction that runs on my contracts and my money. You can help me, or I ride to the Capitol and file a formal inquiry. Weeks of very public questions about how business gets conducted out here. 10 minutes of your time is the friendlier option." Emmett swallowed hard, disappeared into the back room, and returned with a leather folder stuffed with paper. Most of it proved mundane: timber, mining equipment, feed grain. Then, buried in the middle, Ambrose found it. A manifest dated 4 days out, filed under a name he didn't recognize, the Cross Rock Livestock Company. Cargo listed as cattle and feed, destination Ashcroft Depot. Ambrose knew every legitimate outfit in the territory, and Cross Rock wasn't one of them. A shell. A paper company built to move freight without raising an eyebrow. Who filed this? Emmett's voice dropped near a whisper. Harold Ness. Freight agent. Works mostly for the Marsh operation. Up in the hills. How many wagons? Manifest says 5. Heavy load, going by the weight. 5 wagons could carry 40 prisoners, packed tight, maybe more. Della had described a transport pattern of roughly every couple weeks. This had to be it. Thank you, Emmett. If anyone asks, I was never here. Emmett only nodded, miserable. Ambrose stepped back onto the street and nearly walked straight into Marshal Croft. The marshal was big, running to fat, a handlebar mustache, and a badge that caught the light, 2 well-kept pistols, and the flat, empty eyes of a man who'd stopped caring about right or wrong somewhere in the last decade. Ambrose Kane. Long way from Kestrel Flats. False warmth thickened his voice. What brings you to our little town? Business, reviewing some freight contracts. Funny, I heard your contracts have been having some trouble lately, missing shipments. Damaged goods. Real shame. I manage. Croft stepped closer, close enough that Ambrose caught the whiskey on his breath. You're a smart man, Kane. Successful shame if something disrupted all that success. Accidents happen out here, even to rich men. Is that a threat, Marshal? That's advice. From a man who knows how things work around here. Stick to your ranch, your cattle, your money. Leave the law to me. Ambrose held his gaze a long beat, then pushed past him toward his horse, every muscle tight, with the effort of not turning around to finish the conversation with a bullet that would come later. Right now, he had information, and information was worth more than satisfaction. That night, the bunkhouse filled with 11 bodies, Ambrose and Della included. Not an army, barely a militia. Ambrose spread hand-drawn maps across the table, the lodge, the bunkhouse, the corrals, and, beneath it all, the tunnels, every detail Della could recall. 5 wagons leave Millrace Junction in 4 days. That's the transport, but hitting a moving convoy on open ground gets people killed on both sides. We hit the ranch itself first, while the goods and the leadership are both still in one place. Nell leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Sabotage from the inside get the cells open before the shooting starts, so the crossfire doesn't cost lives that already paid enough. I'll go in. Every head turned toward Della. She stepped up to the map. I know that place better than anyone. Here, which guards are lazy, which doors stick where they keep the ammunition. If anyone can get in and out clean, it's me. They'll recognize you. Ambrose's answer came fast, sharp. Which means they won't shoot on sight. They'll want to drag me back to Ruin first. That buys me time to move. Beatrice's voice cut in flat. It's suicide. Maybe. But it's the only plan that gets those cells open before the wagons roll. Ambrose's jaw had gone to a hard line. If you're caught, the rest of us finish it without you. Della held his eyes. This is war. People die in wars. But I didn't survive what I survived to sit safe while somebody else pulls the trigger. I'm going in. The room went quiet. Then, simply, Amos allowed that she was right. Somebody needed to be inside. Ambrose looked as though he wanted to argue every word of it. Della could see the same helpless fury on his face that he must have worn the night. Iris insisted on going to the marshal, but in the end he only gave a single nod. You go in. You don't go alone in spirit, though. Greyhawk and I will be on the ridge. The moment it turns, we come for you. They spent 3 more hours nailing down every detail, who moved where, what signals meant what, where to regroup if it all went sideways. Nell walked the group through her charges twice over, making even Amos, who'd handled dynamite and mining work half his life, look faintly uneasy at how casually she discussed fuse lengths. Wyatt sharpened knives. He almost certainly didn't need sharpened, the way some men needed their hands busy to keep the rest of themselves steady. Greyhawk said almost nothing at all, simply traced the ridge routes on the map with one finger until he'd worn a faint mark into the paper, memorizing ground he'd likely already memorized the first time he'd seen it. It was past midnight before the bunkhouse finally emptied out. Della stayed behind, staring at the map, memorizing every line until she could have walked it blind. The night before the raid, Ambrose found her in the barn checking her saddle for the third time. Nervous, terrified, a small, tired honesty. Good. Keeps you sharp. He leaned against a post, arms folded, looking tired in the particular way of a man who'd carried something heavy for far too long. I've been thinking about Iris, about the last real conversation we had. She was packing a bag, taking her evidence to the marshal. I wanted her to wait, let me handle it. She told me I was good at building things and making money, but I wasn't good at seeing people, that she saw them, saw what they needed and couldn't look away. She was right. I know, his voice had gone rough. I spent 3 years trying to bring the ring down from a distance. Money, investigators' letters through proper channels. It never once occurred to me to just do it myself to get my own hands into it. It's not too late. Ambrose looked at her steadily. Tomorrow night, when you go in, understand something. If it goes wrong, I'm not leaving you behind, whatever we agreed. I've already lost one person to those men. Something twisted quietly in Della's chest. Then don't get yourself killed trying to save me, she finished. Because I intend to walk out of there on my own 2 feet, and I'd rather not carry your death as well as everything else. A small, genuine smile crossed his face. Deal. Dawn broke, cold and clear. Della was already awake, dressed, dark, Peter's coat over everything, her guns checked twice and then a third time for good measure, a knife in her boot, extra ammunition in her pockets, a small tin of matches tucked away in case she needed them. Miss Pruitt met her by the gate and pressed a small 2-shot Derringer into her palm. Hide it somewhere, they won't think to look. Her eyes had gone wet. Come back alive. This house is too full of ghosts already. I'll try, Della promised and meant it. The ride north took most of the day, careful, avoiding open roads, sticking to the tree line where they could. By late afternoon, they reached the ridge above the hidden ranch. It looked exactly as Della remembered: timber lodge, smoke curling from the chimney, corrals full of horses, a bunkhouse for the hands, ordinary in every visible way. No one riding past would guess that beneath the surface, in tunnels carved into the hill, people were caged like livestock. She counted guards by lantern light as the sun sank, 2 at the gate, 1 by the barn, movement behind the lodge windows she couldn't place. Move before full dark. Once they're settled at supper, they get sloppy. Ambrose handed her a pocket watch. Nell lights the barn at midnight. That gives you 6 hours to open those cells and reach the rally point. If you're not out by 1 in the morning, we come in after you. If I'm not out, finish the job without me. That's what matters. Promise me you'll try, he pressed, his own voice cracking slightly on the words. She checked her guns a last time and started down the ridge alone. The descent in failing light was slow, treacherous, every foothold tested before she trusted it. By the time she reached the tree line behind the ranch, full dark had fallen. The guard posted at the tunnel entrance was young, smoking, rifle propped carelessly against the wall. New, which meant careless. She waited until he flicked his cigarette into the dirt, then closed the distance in 3 silent steps. It was quick. It was the first blood she'd taken with her own hands, and it never got easier, no matter how deserved it was. She dragged him out of sight, took his keys, and let herself into the tunnel. The passage sloped downward through damp earth and timber shoring, her candle throwing weak light across the walls. 50 feet in, it opened into a chamber lined with cells, people looking up at her with hollow, frightened eyes. A woman clutching a child, 2 boys barely into their teens, an older man with a bandaged leg, others too, broken by fear to move at all. "I'm getting you out. I need you quiet. Can you do that?" Nods, one after another down the line. The first lock was stubborn, rusted through, but it finally gave with a groan that echoed like a scream in the enclosed space. "Go up the tunnel into the trees, follow the ridge north. There are people waiting to help you." Mother and child fled first. 4 more followed from the second cell. She was working the third lock when boots sounded above her, and someone irritated wanted to know whether the missing guard had checked in yet. Della blew out her candle and pressed herself into shadow, knife in one hand, gun in the other. Someone came down the steps alone, a lantern casting long light ahead of him. 3 steps into the chamber she moved fast out of the dark, and it ended before he could bring his rifle up. His lantern hit the ground and shattered, oil spreading, flame catching, along old dry timber almost instantly. She swore under her breath and ran for the remaining cells, hands slick and trembling on the keys. The last lock finally turned. 6 more prisoners stumbled out, coughing into smoke. Run, stealth, abandon now, and they did. She broke into open night air gasping, and the shouting had already started behind her. The fire, the open cells, a dead guard. They knew. She ran for the tree line as gunfire chased her heels, heard Ambrose's rifle crack once from the ridge and a man fall, heard Greyhawk's rifle answer a heartbeat later and another go down. She hit the trees and kept running until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out, until she stumbled into a small clearing and found Ambrose already there with the horses. "Get on!" Something tight and unspoken sat behind the words. She mounted, and they rode hard until the sounds of pursuit finally thinned behind them. The rally point was a hidden hollow 2 miles north, where the freed prisoners huddled around a small fire Greyhawk had built while waiting. They looked terrified but alive, and Della slid off her horse on shaking legs, Ambrose catching her before she went down entirely. "You did it." Barely. Her breath still came ragged. "They know now. They'll be hunting. Come sunrise, we finish this before they can regroup." Around the fire, the freed prisoners watched her with something close to awe. She had walked into that place and brought them out of it. But all Della could think of, staring at her own hands, was the weight of the 2 men she'd killed to make it happen, and the part of her that still felt every bit of it, even when she'd sworn to herself she felt nothing at all anymore. Consider becoming a channel member if a story like Della's is worth 10 minutes of your time. The join button sits right beside the channel name, 1 tap away. Morning brought no comfort with it. Della woke before dawn with her back against a rock, Peter's coat pulled tight around her shoulders, the freed prisoners sleeping in exhausted heaps near the dying fire. Ambrose sat watch near the hollow's entrance, rifle across his knees, staring toward the hills as though he could see straight through them to whatever was already riding their way. "They'll come," he said low once she'd joined him. "Once Rune finds those empty cells and 2 dead men, he'll know exactly what happened, and he won't wait long to answer it." Greyhawk emerged from the shadows without a sound. Riders. South, maybe 2 miles, 6 or 7 men, moving fast. Ambrose was already on his feet. Ours or theirs, can't tell yet. They came through morning mist minutes later, Amos in the lead, his scarred face grim. Wyatt and 2 others behind him, all of them looking as though they'd ridden through the night without stopping. Amos dismounted hard. The transport's been moved up. Those wagons leave Millrace this morning, not 4 days from now. The ring's spooked after last night. They're pushing everything out before we can hit them again. Emmett Doyle got word through back channels. He's been watching the junction for us since you 2 talked. Della looked at the freed prisoners, then at Ambrose, and saw the same calculation working behind his eyes that was working behind hers. They couldn't drag exhausted, frightened people into open country toward gunfire, and they couldn't leave them unguarded either. "Greyhawk, can you get them back to Kestrel Flats? Back trails, no main roads." 2 days, Greyhawk allowed. "But yes," Ambrose passed him a folded letter. "Give this to Miss Pruitt. She'll know what to do." The freed prisoners gathered what little they had, mostly just the clothes on their backs and a fragile new hope that this particular nightmare might actually be ending. Della watched them follow Greyhawk into the trees like refugees fleeing a war zone, which in every way that mattered, they were. We ride. Amos was already turning for his horse. If we're not in position before those wagons and whatever's left of that operation converge, this whole plan falls apart. They pushed their horses hard, harder than sense allowed. 20 miles of rough country to cover before the enemy could regroup and finish moving what remained of their operation east. Della rode beside Ambrose, Wand tearing at her hair, Peter's coat snapping behind her, and thought about the people still locked in wagons somewhere ahead, about her brother, about the way one moment of courage in a saloon had cost him everything, about the way Rune had smiled while Peter screamed. They reached the hidden ranch again by mid-morning, and it was already a different place than the one Della had slipped into the night before. Men moving with purpose now, wagons being loaded in a rush, smoke still curling faintly from the burned section of the lodge. Rune Marsh himself stood in the yard barking. Orders Deke Yarrow at his shoulder, Tobias nowhere in sight yet. Panic had pushed them to consolidate everything at the ranch, rather than risk the open road, load the last of the prisoners here, move them out together under heavier guard, and abandon the smaller shipment plan entirely. It was, in its own way, exactly what Ambrose's company needed. Every villain they wanted, in one place, at one time. Nell had charges rigged along the fence line within the hour, and the company took up positions along the tree line ringing the yard. "Once the shooting starts," Ambrose warned them, "low and even. Priority is the cells and the wagons, not the fight. Get people out first. The rest we settle after." Somewhere inside that lodge was the man who had branded her, and the fireplace where, weeks ago in another life, she might have imagined herself warming her hands like any ordinary guest. The attack began with Nell's charges, a controlled roar that collapsed the north fence and sent horses scattering through the yard in chaos. Amos and Wyatt came in low from the east, rifles already working, and Beatrice went straight for the wagons, cutting the first canvas open before the guards even understood where the shooting was coming from. Smoke rolled thick across the yard within minutes, hiding as much as it revealed, and men who'd never expected to be fired upon on their own ground scattered in every direction at once, some fighting, more running, a few simply standing frozen with their hands half raised. Ambrose and Della moved together toward the lodge, and it was there, in the smoke and confusion, that Deke Yarrow found them first, coming around the corner of the porch with a pistol already raised. Della didn't hesitate. She caught his wrist, drove him back into the doorframe, and in the scramble that followed, her hand closed around the iron fireplace, poker-propped, just inside the entry, the same room she would realize only later, where Rune Marsh had once stood and smiled while they burned his mark into her skin. It ended there, in that doorway, with the weight of 2 weeks in chains, and a brother's death behind every swing. When it was over, she stood breathing hard over a man who would never brand anyone again, and something in her chest, finally, quietly, came loose. Outside, Ambrose found Rune Marsh in the yard, revolver drawn, barking for his men to fall back toward the tunnel. There was no long exchange, no speech about wives or promises, only a leveled aim and a shot that finally settled 3 years of grief in a single instant. Rune went down. Tobias, wounded in the opening minutes of the assault, had retreated deeper into the lodge, and by the time the fire from Nell's charges reached the upper floor, there was no clean way in or out left for him to take. The mansion burned, and whatever justice the law would never have delivered arrived instead in smoke rising over the pines. They freed 41 prisoners from the tunnels that morning, men, women, and a scattering of children, all of them blinking against daylight they'd feared they might never see again. Beatrice and Wyatt worked the wagons free of their guards, and by the time the fire had taken the lodge fully, the fight was already over in every way that counted. Inside what remained of Rune's office, Ambrose found a strong box of ledgers, names, dates, payments, a record of every lawman and judge on the Coldwater payroll, Marshal Croft and a territorial judge named Hollis chief among them. They rode out with the ledgers, the freed prisoners, and what was left of their small, strange company, and it took the better part of a week for the news to finish traveling. Marshal Croft removed from his post and answering to federal marshals instead, Judge Hollis's name attached to an investigation that would end his career, if not his freedom. The Coldwater Ring's remaining operations scattered and leaderless within a month. It wasn't everything, it never is. But it was more than 3 years of grief and money alone had managed to accomplish. Ambrose spent much of that first week in the capital himself, ledgers in a locked case chained to his wrist the whole journey, sitting across desks from men who'd spent years politely ignoring every letter he'd ever sent them about Coldwater, found themselves considerably more willing to listen. It wasn't satisfying. Exactly. Paperwork rarely is, even paperwork that ends a criminal empire. But watching bureaucrats scramble to undo 8 years of looking away was its own quiet kind of justice, and Ambrose found he didn't much mind sitting through it. Before they left the hills for good, Ambrose kept the promise he'd made in a lamplit study weeks earlier. They found Peter's grave marked only by a disturbed patch of earth near the tunnel entrance, and they brought him home properly, laid him to rest on a hilltop above Kestrel flats that caught the first light of every sunrise. Della stood over the grave a long while, Peter's coat still on her shoulders, and let the silence be the only thing that needed saying. In the months that followed, Kestrel Flats changed. What had once been simply a very wealthy man's very large ranch slowly became something else entirely. A place where survivors of the Coldwater Ring and outfits like it could come to heal without questions, without judgment. Word of it traveled the way word travels among people who've learned not to trust official channels. Quiet, careful, passed from one frightened stranger to the next along roads no marshal's map would ever show. Miss Brewitt ran the household still, now with 2 extra pairs of hands trained under her. Amos took over the forge and taught 2 of the younger arrivals a trade steady enough to build a life on. Beatrice taught the newer women to shoot straight and stand steady, the way someone had once needed to teach her back before there'd been anyone willing. Nell kept the perimeter honest and swore, not entirely in jest, that she'd rig the whole valley to blow before she let Coldwater or anything like it come calling twice. Greyhawk came and went as he always had, watching over trails no one else could see, appearing at the gate every so often with someone new. He'd found wandering half-starved and terrified, never explaining how he'd known to look for them at all. And Della stayed not as a guest, not as an employee, but exactly as she'd bargained for from the very first night, Ambrose Kane's equal partner in every sense that mattered, running Kestrel Flats alongside him, deciding together who came and who was turned away, who needed protecting, and how far either of them was willing to go to provide it. Her name went on the ranch's ledgers beside his, not below it. When new hands were hired, they answered to both of them equally, and learned quickly that Della Vance's word carried exactly as much weight at Kestrel Flats as Ambrose Kane's did, brand and all. There was no wedding, no romance, dressed up to make their story tidier than it actually was. What they'd built together was something steadier than that and rarer. 2 people who had each lost everything to the same evil who had chosen, deliberately and without illusion, to spend what remained of their lives making sure fewer people ever had to survive what they had survived. Some nights they sat together in the study, under Iris's photograph and beside the coat that still hung by the door, for Peter saying little, needing to say little, 2 survivors who understood each other in the particular way. Years later, when new arrivals rode up the long drive to Kestrel Flats, frightened, broken, uncertain whether kindness still existed anywhere in the world, it was often Della who met them first at the gate, Peter's old coat still worn soft with time, offering the only thing she'd ever needed to hear herself in a back room full of blood and flour dust. "You're safe now." And this time, unlike so many promises made in that territory before it, it was always, always true. The hilltop above the ranch still caught the first light every sunrise, same as it always had, and Peter's grave sat there now beside a small stone marker Ambrose had commissioned, without being asked, and beside it, in time a second stone for Iris moved there at Della's quiet insistence. Because a woman who'd given her life, trying to save strangers, deserved to rest somewhere, that had finally become exactly what she'd always wanted the whole territory to be. 2 names, 2 graves, 1 hillside, and below it a ranch full of people who were alive, because 2 grieving strangers had once decided that revenge done right could be turned into something that outlasted the grief itself. If Della's story kept you here till the end, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, and help the next story reach you.